After 15 years of marriage, my wife looked me dead in the eyes and said she was leaving me for someone who truly deserved her. I didn't yell, I didn't argue. I just nodded and walked out of her life. She thought she had won. But she had no idea that my quiet exit had just lit the fuse to a bomb that would detonate in her life exactly 48 hours later, starting with a panicked phone call from her boss. This is a story about how a silent man's hidden power brought a corporate empire, and the woman who betrayed him, to its knees. You're going to want to hear this to the very end. So do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and comment below what you would have done in my situation. Trust me, it helps the channel more than you know. Now let's get into the story. 15 years. It's a strange amount of time. It's long enough to feel like a lifetime, but short enough to remember the beginning like it was yesterday. I remember our first apartment, the one with the leaky faucet and the walls so thin you could hear our neighbors sneeze. We didn't have much money, but we were a team. We painted those cheap walls ourselves, laughing as we got more paint on each other than on the drywall. I remember staying up until 3 a.m., helping Chloe rehearse for the presentation that would land her the junior executive job. I'd play the role of the skeptical board member, and she'd practice her pitch until it was flawless. Her dreams were my dreams. That's how it was. But dreams, when they come true, have a funny way of changing the dreamer. The promotions came, one after another. Our tiny apartment turned into a respectable townhouse, and then into the sprawling, minimalist mansion she saw in an architecture magazine. The house was beautiful, filled with expensive furniture and cold, empty spaces. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom for her success. And somewhere along the way, I became part of the furniture too. An old, comfortable chair she was used to having around but no longer truly saw. Our conversations changed. They went from we to I. I closed the biggest deal in the company's history. I am being considered for a partnership. When I'd talk about my day, about the quiet satisfaction of my own work, I could see her eyes glaze over. She'd give a polite, distant smile, her attention already drifting back to the glowing screen of her phone, which had become a permanent extension of her hand. She started calling my stability a lack of ambition. My contentment was a failure to launch. I was the steady, predictable ground she stood on, and she had grown to resent me for it. She was a rocket, and she wanted a launch pad made of fire and thunder, not the quiet, solid earth I provided. I was the foundation she built her empire on, a foundation she had forgotten was even there. And she was about to learn what happens when you try to walk away from the very ground beneath your feet. The cracks didn't appear all at once. It was more like a slow, creeping frost, starting at the edges of our marriage and working its way inward until the whole thing was fragile enough to shatter. It started with small things. I'd cook her favorite dinner, the pasta dish we learned to make together in that first tiny apartment, and she'd call at 9 o'clock to say she was stuck in a strategy session and had already eaten. The food would sit on the counter, growing cold under the tin foil, a sad monument to a tradition that now only I seem to remember. Then came the phone. It became her constant companion, a third person in our marriage, and frankly, the one she paid more attention to. She'd sit on the couch next to me, the television playing to an empty room, while she angled the screen away, a faint, private smile playing on her lips as her thumbs moved in a blur. I wasn't a fool. I knew that smile wasn't for a work email. It was the smile of a shared secret, a private joke, an intimacy that no longer included me. I told myself it was nothing, a coping mechanism for her high-stress job. It's a lie you tell yourself when the truth is too painful to confront. Her language began to change, too. It became peppered with phrases and philosophies that didn't sound like her. They sounded like her boss, Mark. If you're not crushing, you're being crushed. Sentiment is a liability in business. Mark was this charismatic, cutthroat executive who had become her mentor, and his voice was slowly replacing her own. One evening, I mentioned wanting to take that trip to the national parks we had planned for years. She scoffed, not even looking up from her laptop. David, be realistic. Mark always says that personal leave is just a signal that you're not committed. It was the casual way she said his name, the way his opinion was now the gospel truth, that made my stomach tighten. He wasn't just her boss anymore. He was her North Star. And I was just a forgotten landmark from a previous journey. I was looking at a stranger who happened to have my wife's face, a woman reprogrammed with a new, ruthless operating system. I could feel the pressure building behind the dam of our 15 years. All it needed was one final push. And it was coming sooner than I thought. The final push came on a Tuesday. I remember it was raining, a cold, persistent drizzle that matched the chill that had settled inside our home. I was in the living room, reading a book, when Chloe walked in. She didn't drop her keys in the bowl by the door like she always did. She placed them down, softly, deliberately. She didn't change out of her sharp, corporate attire. She stood there for a moment, her posture perfectly straight, like a soldier about to deliver a difficult report. "David," she said, and the tone of her voice made the hairs on my arm stand up. "Can we talk?" I put my book down. This was it. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with all the unspoken words of the past few years. She didn't sit. She stood before me, more like a prosecutor than a wife, and delivered a speech that I could tell she had rehearsed. It was filled with all the expected phrases. "We've grown apart. We want different things. This isn't easy for me." It was a cold, clean, corporate-approved script for dismantling a life. I listened, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. And then she delivered the final, devastating blow. She looked me right in the eye, her own gaze clear and without a trace of remorse. "I'm leaving," she said. "After 15 years. I'm leaving. I've found someone who really deserves me." Of all the words she could have used, those were the ones she chose. It wasn't just an announcement of departure. It was a verdict on my worth. A 15-year performance review that ended with a failing grade. The implication was venomous. Our life, our history, my love and support. None of it was ever good enough. I wasn't what she deserved. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the rain tapping against the windowpane, each drop counting down the seconds of our life together. She had delivered her final judgment, the closing argument in the trial of our marriage. She stood there, waiting for the tears, the anger, the begging. She was waiting for me to fall apart. But she had profoundly miscalculated. In that deafening silence, as her cruel words hung in the air between us, I saw the truth. What was there to fight for? The woman I had married, the one who laughed with paint on her nose and dreamed of seeing the world with me, was gone. She wouldn't have said those words. The person standing in front of me was a stranger, a corporate raider who had just completed a hostile takeover of my wife's soul. She was braced for a storm, for the emotional explosion she felt she was entitled to. It would have fed her narrative, confirmed her decision that I was a passionate but ultimately weak man she was right to leave. So, I didn't give her the drama she craved. I didn't give her tears. I didn't give her a single desperate plea. I let the silence stretch on for a few more seconds, letting her see the profound disappointment in my eyes. I saw a flicker of confusion on her face. This wasn't in her script. Then I gave her my answer. It wasn't a word, but an action. I gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of agreement that she was right. It was a nod of acceptance, an acknowledgement that the final page of our story had been written. I accepted her decision, and in that same moment, I accepted that she was no longer my concern. Without another glance at her, I turned and walked up the stairs. Each step was heavy with the weight of 15 years of memories. I went into our bedroom, took a duffel bag from the back of the closet, and packed only the essentials. A few changes of clothes, my laptop, my toiletries. I left behind the photos, the gifts, the shared life we had accumulated. They belonged to a man who no longer existed. When I came back downstairs, she was still standing in the same spot, watching me with a look of utter bewilderment. I walked past her to the small table by the door, took the house key off my keychain, and placed it gently on the polished wood. Keys are for people who belong. I didn't belong there anymore. I walked out the front door and didn't look back, closing it softly behind me. The quiet click of the latch was the only goodbye I needed to give. As I walked to my car in the cold rain, I left her standing alone in her big empty house with nothing but the echo of a closing door. She thought she was free. She had no idea she had just become the sole prisoner of the life she had chosen. I can picture it perfectly. I can see her standing there in the entryway, listening to the sound of my car pulling out of the driveway and disappearing into the rain. For a moment, I'm sure my quiet exit left her bewildered. It was an anticlimax. She had prepared for a grand dramatic opera, and instead I gave her a silent film. But her confusion would have quickly melted away, replaced by a feeling she would mistake for victory. She would have reframed my dignity as weakness, my silence as surrender. It was the confirmation she needed. I wasn't a man who would even fight for her, so how could I possibly deserve her? And then I know exactly what she did next. She would have reached for her phone, her true partner in all of this. Her fingers would have flown across the screen, dialing a number she knew by heart. I can almost hear her voice, no longer cold and rehearsed, but alive and giddy with triumph. "It's done," she would have whispered into the phone. "Mark, I'm free." The rest of the evening would have been a celebration for one. She would have opened that ridiculously expensive bottle of champagne we were supposedly saving for a special occasion. I suppose for her this was one. She would have wandered through the rooms of her house, glass in hand, the silence no longer feeling empty but full of possibility. She probably put on that loud, aggressive music she loved and I always found distracting, turning the volume up higher than she ever did when I was there. She was exorcising my presence, erasing the quiet ghost of our 15 years. She was toasting her future, a future where she and Mark would be the ultimate power couple, unstoppable and brilliant. She spent the next day and a half on cloud 9, the queen of her newly conquered castle, completely unaware that the ground beneath it was already turning to quicksand. Every part of her celebration was a monument to her own ignorance. And the first tremor was scheduled to arrive the very next morning. Chloe would have walked into her office the next morning feeling 10 feet tall. Freedom, in the corporate world, is just another word for power. And she, having shed the dead weight of her unambitious husband, would have felt more powerful than ever. She would have greeted her team with a sharp, energized smile, ready to conquer the day, ready to prove to herself and to Mark that she was everything she had promised to be. The world was her oyster. The first ripple would have been small, almost unnoticeable. A junior analyst, a nervous young man named Kevin, would have approached her desk around 10 a.m. "Excuse me, Miss Sterling," he'd stammer. "I can't seem to access the Stonewater Group's investment portal. It says it's down for unscheduled maintenance. We need those numbers for the quarterly forecast." I can picture her reaction perfectly. A wave of annoyance, a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Then call IT, Kevin," she would have snapped, not even looking up from her screen. "I'm a CEO, not a help desk technician. Solve it." To her, it was a meaningless technical problem, a frustrating gnat buzzing around her glorious day. She had no idea she was looking at the first thread of the web that was about to ensnare her. You see, the Stonewater portal wasn't down. It wasn't broken, and IT would never find the problem. I had simply, with a few keystrokes from my laptop in a quiet coffee shop across town, placed the entire system into a state of hibernation. It was a feature I'd built into its core architecture years ago, a digital dead man switch, a way to freeze everything without causing a destructive crash. It was a quiet, controlled action. It was me clearing my throat. Throughout the day, the frustration in her office would have grown. The IT team was baffled. There was no breach, no virus, no hardware failure. The system was perfect, yet inaccessible. She left work that evening irritated by the incompetence of her staff, never once suspecting the truth. She thought it was a random, frustrating glitch. She had no idea the glitch had a name. And it was mine. If day 1 was a ripple, day 2 was the tide pulling out before a tsunami. Chloe arrived at the office that Friday morning expecting solutions, but what she found was the quiet, simmering panic that precedes a corporate disaster. The Stonewater portal wasn't just down anymore. The problem had spread. Now, entire swaths of their financial data were locked. The automated accounting systems were spitting out error messages, and the quarterly projection reports, the very documents that measured the health and future of her company, were completely inaccessible. The mood in the office was toxic with anxiety. The usual morning buzz was replaced by hushed, worried whispers. Whiteboard-filled conference rooms became war rooms where frantic IT technicians, now on their 36th hour without sleep, were no closer to an answer. This was no longer a simple glitch. The company's financial nervous system was being paralyzed, and no one knew why. But Chloe, in her magnificent arrogance, still didn't see the truth. She saw only incompetence. She strode through the office like a furious general, her voice sharp as she demanded answers from people who had none. She held an emergency meeting where she didn't listen, she just threatened. "This is a multi-million-dollar-a-day failure," she yelled. "I want the person responsible for this found, and I want them fired. I want solutions, not excuses." She was so busy looking for a scapegoat that she never thought to look at the cause. From my quiet corner of the city, I watched it all unfold through the administrative backdoors I had built. They were looking for a hacker, a virus, a phantom enemy who had breached their walls. What they couldn't comprehend was that the architect of the house was simply changing the locks. I wasn't destroying their home, I was just revoking their key. By lunchtime, the panic was palpable. Nothing was fixed. Things were getting worse. Chloe was in her glass-walled office, fuming, deciding who would be the first to fall on their sword for this mess. She was rehearsing the speech she'd give to fire her head of IT. But just as she reached for the intercom button, it buzzed first. The voice of her young assistant crackled through, thin and tight with a fear she had never heard before. "Ms. Sterling, Mr. Mark is coming to your office. Right now. He sounds like something is terribly wrong." The door to her office didn't open, it flew open, crashing against the wall. Mark stood in the doorway, but he wasn't the slick, confident leader she idolized. His face was pale, his designer suit was rumpled, and his eyes were wide with a terror she had never seen before. He looked like a man who had just stared into the abyss. He slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the suddenly silent office. "Mark, what is it? What's happened?" Chloe asked, rising from her chair. He ignored her question, his gaze locking onto hers with a frightening intensity. He walked directly to her desk and leaned over it. His hands braced on the expensive wood. "Forget the servers. Forget the data," he said, his voice a low, ragged whisper. "I just got off the phone. With the legal team. From the Stonewater Group. My lawyers. They had their instructions. Wait for my signal, and when given, make a single phone call." The signal was sent 5 minutes before Mark burst through her door. A perfectly timed pincer movement. Chloe was confused. Our investors? What did they say? Mark let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. What did they say? They said they're out, Chloe. They're invoking Clause 7B of the Primary Investment Charter. Bad faith conduct. They're pulling every last dollar out of this company. Effective immediately. Chloe's face went white. What? That's impossible. On what grounds? Bad faith. Who? This is when his terror finally boiled over into rage. He slammed his fist down on her desk, rattling everything on it. That's what I asked them. And they told me to ask you. He roared, his voice cracking. He pointed a shaking finger at her. So I'm asking you, Chloe, what did you do to your husband? The question hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back, her mind reeling, unable to connect the two catastrophic events. David, she stammered. What are you talking about? He has nothing to do with this. He's just... David. Mark stared at her, his expression a mixture of pity and utter contempt. He has everything to do with this, you fool, he yelled, his voice echoing in the glass office. The lawyers said the kill order came directly from the group's founder. From the man himself. Chloe, do you know what he just did? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Her company, her career, her entire world was on fire, and the man holding the match was the last person she ever would have suspected. Her mind was a whirlwind of denial and dawning, terrifying comprehension. And for the first time in a very long time, Chloe was truly, completely powerless. Chloe stared at Mark, her mind refusing to process the words, searching for some other explanation. A mistake. A cruel joke. No, she whispered, shaking her head. You're wrong. It's not possible. David manages logistics for a mid-level import company. I've seen his pay stubs. He's normal. Mark let out a hollow, broken laugh. He stumbled over to his own desk, fumbled with a drawer, and pulled out a thick file, the original investment prospectus. He threw it onto Chloe's desk. It landed with a heavy thud that echoed in the silent room. We all thought he was normal, Chloe. That was his genius, he said, his voice dripping with a newfound, horrified respect for me. He jabbed a finger at the signature page, the one they had all seen 100 times. The signature, he breathed. It's always just been D.S. Waterman. We never met him. No one has. He's a ghost, a legend who built a financial empire from nothing and manages it all through his legal team. We all thought he was some 80-year-old recluse living on a private island. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We never bothered to look at the incorporation papers. We never asked what the DS stood for. David Stone Waterman. Your husband, Chloe. Your quiet, supportive, unambitious husband is the Stonewater Group. The truth hit her not like a wave, but like a building collapsing on top of her. She physically recoiled, sinking into her expensive leather chair as if her bones could no longer support her. All the strength, all the arrogance, drained from her face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The last 15 years of her life began to flash before her eyes, but now every memory was twisted, recontextualized by this single, impossible truth. My lack of ambition wasn't failure. It was focus on a different empire. My hobbies were multi-million-dollar investments. The man she thought she was leaving behind was the very man who had built the pedestal she was standing on. And from my vantage point, I felt a deep, profound sadness. I never hid it to deceive her. I did it because I loved her. I saw how much the spotlight meant to her, how she thrived on being the star. So I built my world in the shadows so she could be the sun. I funded her company anonymously because I wanted her success to be hers and hers alone. It was supposed to be the ultimate gift, a foundation of unconditional support she never had to see. I never dreamed she would despise the foundation and try to burn it to the ground. In her desperate climb to the top, she had kicked away the very man who owned the entire mountain. And now she was in a free fall. As Chloe sat frozen in her chair, Mark continued, his voice now a hollow vessel for the devastating truth. He was realizing the extent of the situation in real time, just as she was. It's not just the money, Chloe, he stammered, gesturing vaguely at the silent computer screen on her desk. It's everything. The Stonewater portal, the accounting software, the secure data servers that have been locked for 2 days. His legal team just confirmed it. David didn't just fund them. He built them. From scratch. He wrote the code himself. The words sliced through Chloe's shock and struck a new layer of humiliation. She would have remembered the countless nights she'd seen me on my laptop, the screen filled with lines of code and complex diagrams. She'd always dismissed it as my little hobby, something to keep my simple mind occupied while she was out networking, making the real connections. Now, the horrifying reality dawned on her. While she was shaking hands and posing for pictures, I was at home, single-handedly forging the digital backbone of the very empire she claimed to rule. Every success she had celebrated, every quarterly report she had proudly presented, was generated by a machine of my own creation. A company is more than its brand and its charismatic CEO. It is an engine. Chloe was the beautiful, polished hood ornament and the confident hand on the steering wheel, and I wanted her to be. But I was the one who had designed and built the engine. Every piston, every gear, every line of code was mine. I had done it to make the company flawless and stable for her, so that it would never fail her. The supreme irony is that the one component I could not control was the driver. But I am a careful man. I believe in trust, but I also believe in structure. And in every foundational document, every investment agreement, and especially in every executive leadership contract, I embedded safeguards. Fail-safes. They were designed to protect the integrity of the company from any threat, internal or external. Chloe had signed her executive contract years ago with a triumphant flourish of her pen, smiling for a press release photo. She never bothered to read the fine print. She was about to learn that the signature she was proudest of was the one that authorized her own professional demolition. Because in leaving me, she hadn't just broken a vow. She had triggered a clause. Specifically, Clause 11.b. Clause 11.b. It sounds so mundane, doesn't it? Just another line of impenetrable legal jargon buried deep within a 100-page contract. In my own files, I called it something simpler. The Integrity Clause. It was a standard feature in all my major investments, a non-negotiable article designed to protect the company's soul. As Mark frantically scanned the document his lawyers had just sent over, Chloe would have seen the words that were about to condemn her. I can recite it from memory. In the event that a key person, defined herein as the CEO or any C-suite executive, engages in acts of moral turpitude, gross misconduct, or a fundamental breach of good faith that could be reasonably seen to damage the reputation, stability, or stakeholder trust in the company. It goes on, but that's the important part. That was the trigger. And the consequences were not open for debate. They were absolute and immediate. First, immediate termination for cause. No severance package, no golden parachute. Just a box for her personal items. Second, the complete forfeiture of all company stock options, both vested and unvested. The tens of millions of dollars in equity she believed was hers, the ultimate symbol of her success, would simply vanish into thin air. And third, the final brutal twist of the knife. A full clawback. The company would have the legal right to demand the immediate return of every dollar paid to her in performance-based bonuses over the last 24 months. Chloe would surely think it was a personal matter, a husband's revenge. She would be wrong. It was a business decision. She, the CEO, had begun a clandestine affair with her direct superior, the COO Mark. She had acted in catastrophic bad faith to dissolve a foundational partnership, our marriage, that the company's silent stability was built upon. It was a pattern of deceit and terrible judgment that proved she could no longer be trusted to lead. She hadn't just betrayed a husband. According to the bylaws of the company I owned, she had betrayed a primary stakeholder. When I wrote that clause, I envisioned protecting my assets from some hypothetical, greedy executive I might encounter down the road. I never once dreamed the person who would fit that description perfectly would be the woman I shared my life with. There was no loophole. There was no escape. The signature at the bottom of the contract was hers. The trap was perfect. And she had just armed it and walked right into it. For a long moment, Chloe didn't move. She just stared at the contract on her desk as if the words themselves were physically pinning her to her chair. The numbers must have been screaming through her mind. The millions in stock, the years of bonuses, the entire financial empire she believed was the proof of her superiority. I imagine the first sound she made was a small, choked gasp as the financial reality hit her. It was all gone. Every last cent. But then, a deeper, more terrible realization would have followed. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the story she had so carefully crafted for herself and for the world. Chloe Sterling, the self-made titan of industry. The woman who had clawed her way to the top through sheer brilliance and grit. In an instant, that entire identity was exposed as a fraud. She wasn't self-made. She was secretly sponsored. She hadn't built an empire. She had been gifted a kingdom and had foolishly tried to stage a coup against its silent, benevolent king. Her eyes, wide with horror, would have darted around her office, at the awards on the shelves, the panoramic view of the city, the symbols of a success that she now understood was never truly hers. Then her gaze would have landed on Mark, her partner, her co-conspirator, her better man. She would have looked at him, searching for an ally, a hand to hold in the wreckage. But she wouldn't find one. She would have seen him staring back at her not with love or sympathy, but with the cold, dead eyes of a survivor. He was already calculating his own escape. He took a small step back from her desk, a tiny movement that was as final as a door slamming shut. In his eyes, she was no longer a partner. She was the contagion that had infected them all. And that is when she would have finally broken. The impenetrable armor of the CEO would have cracked and shattered, revealing the terrified, broken person beneath. A sob, raw and guttural, would have torn from her throat. She would have collapsed over her desk, her head in her hands, her body racked with the kind of despair that comes from losing everything, especially your own sense of self. I didn't feel joy picturing this moment. I only felt a profound sense of waste. I had set the consequences in motion, but her choices had walked her right to this cliff. And as I imagined the sound of her world shattering, it didn't sound like victory. It sounded like the ghost of the woman I once loved, finally realizing she had destroyed herself. Mark didn't waste a second. As Chloe sat there, broken at her desk, he had already moved on to the next phase, his own survival. He saw her not as the woman he supposedly loved, but as the epicenter of a disaster he had to contain. He picked up his desk phone, his back turned to her, and his voice was transformed. Gone was the panicked lover. In his place was the cold, calculating executive. "Yes, get me security," he said, his voice clipped and void of all emotion. "To the CEO's office. Immediately. Ms. Sterling's employment has been terminated by an emergency vote of the board. She is to be escorted from the premises." Chloe would have watched this final betrayal happen as if in a dream, too numb to even protest. The man she had sacrificed her marriage for was now the one ordering her execution. Within minutes, 2 uniformed security guards, men who had previously greeted her with a respectful "Good morning, Ms. Sterling," entered her office. Their faces were impassive. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice polite but firm, "we'll need you to gather your personal belongings." And so began the final humiliating ritual of corporate death. She took a small, pathetic cardboard box and began to fill it with the trinkets of her former life. A framed photo from a magazine cover, a silver pen gifted to her by a client, a motivational paperweight that now seemed like a cruel joke. Then came the walk. Escorted by the 2 guards, she moved from her glass fortress through the open-plan office she had designed for transparency. And now, that transparency became her arena of shame. The bustling office fell silent as she passed. Every head turned. No one whispered. The silence was far worse. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a public spectacle. These were the people she had led, the people who had once admired or feared her. Now they just stared, their faces a mixture of pity, shock, and for some, a grim sense of satisfaction. There's a saying, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. But it's not the fall that breaks you. It's the sudden stop at the bottom, and the realization that everyone you know is watching. The automatic glass doors of the lobby, the ones that had once slid open to welcome her to her kingdom, now slid shut behind her, locking her out forever. She was left standing on the cold pavement of the street, clutching a cardboard box, just another face in the anonymous city crowd. Her empire was gone. Standing on that crowded sidewalk, with the cold box in her hands and the glass tower of her former life looming over her, Chloe must have felt an aloneness so profound it was like drowning. Everything she had valued, her title, her reputation, her wealth, her better man, had been stripped away or had abandoned her within the span of a few hours. In that moment of absolute desperation, when she had nothing and no one left, her instincts would have guided her back to the one person who had ever been her rock. Her fingers, trembling, would have pulled out her phone and dialed my number. My phone buzzed on the wooden table beside me. I was miles away, in a quiet place, looking out over a calm lake. I saw her name flash on the screen. For a heartbeat, the ghost of the man I used to be wanted to answer. The man who would have done anything to soothe her tears. But that man was gone and that marriage was over. Answering that call would be like trying to glue together the pieces of a shattered mirror. You'll only cut your fingers, and you'll still be left with the same broken reflection. So I silenced the call and let it go to voicemail. But I knew I owed her a final word. Not a conversation, not an argument, but a clean and absolute end. I opened a new message and typed out the last words I would ever send to her. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, and then I pressed send. Back on that lonely sidewalk, she would have seen the call go unanswered. Her last hope was likely fading when my text message notification lit up her screen. She would have opened it, desperate for any lifeline. But the words she read would not have been an offer of help. They were an epitaph for our life together. The message said, "You told me you were leaving to find the life you deserved. The life you have now is the one you chose. I am truly sorry for everything. Goodbye, Chloe." There was no anger in those words. No vengeance. But in many ways that was worse. It was the detached finality of a closed door, locked forever. It told her there was nothing to fight for, nothing to appeal. The last bridge back to the world she had destroyed was now gone. And as she stared at that final word, goodbye, she would have finally understood the true meaning of being completely and utterly alone. That text message was the last time we ever communicated. After I sent it, I put my phone down on the table, silencing it for good, and took a deep breath of the cool, clean air. I wasn't in a high-rise office or a sterile mansion. I was in a small, comfortable cabin overlooking a calm blue lake, hundreds of miles away from the life I had left behind. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the whisper of the wind through the pine trees. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was mine. On my laptop screen wasn't a stock portfolio worth billions, but a business plan for a small, innovative startup that a couple of bright kids were trying to launch. A company built on a good idea, not on ego. It was never about the money for me. It was about the architecture of a thing, the intellectual challenge of building something that works, something that lasts. I had done it once for her in the shadows, hoping to give her a perfect kingdom. Now I would do it for myself, out in the open. I heard, months later through the lawyers, that the house was finally being sold. I pictured her there one last time, not as the triumphant queen, but as a ghost walking through vast empty rooms, packing away the remnants of a life that was never really hers to begin with. Her bright future, the one she had sacrificed everything for, had been reduced to a pile of cardboard boxes and bitter regrets. She had chased a version of success she saw in magazines. Loud, flashy, and ruthless. The kind of success that demands to be seen. She never understood that true power, the kind that endures, doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need awards or recognition. It's quiet. It's patient. It is built on a foundation that can never be taken from you because you don't show it off to the world. You simply are. As I took a sip of my morning coffee and got back to work on my new project, a small smile touched my lips for the first time in a very long time. I was finally building a life that I deserved. It's been 3 years since I sent that final text. Time has a way of smoothing the sharp edges of painful memories, turning them from open wounds into faded scars. My life now is profoundly different from the one I once lived, but it feels infinitely more honest. The small startup I helped fund? It's thriving. Not as a corporate giant, but as a respected, innovative company known for its ethos and its quality products. I rediscovered the joy of building, not for profit or recognition, but for the simple satisfaction of creating something good with good people. The peace I've found in that quiet is worth more than any applause. Of course, I know you're wondering what happened to them. I never went looking for answers, but information has a way of finding you. The company that was once Chloe's kingdom, without its true architect and foundation, faltered and collapsed in less than a year after I left. It was broken up and sold off for parts, a footnote in business history. Mark, in his desperate attempt to blame Chloe for everything, permanently tarnished his own reputation. He was seen as a captain who would gladly sink his own ship to save himself, the kind of leader no one would ever trust again. And Chloe, from what I heard through distant legal circles, she moved back to her hometown. She lives a quiet life, far from the world of glass towers and corporate warfare she once ruled. She took back her maiden name and works a simple job at a small local firm. I don't know if she ever found happiness, or if she's made peace with the ghosts of her ambition. But I truly hope she found a piece of herself that wasn't defined by a job title or a bank account. In the end, this wasn't a story about revenge. Revenge is an empty pursuit. This was a story about consequences. It's a reminder that the strongest foundations are often the ones unseen, and that the most fragile things in life, trust, integrity, and self-respect, are the easiest to destroy and impossible to ever rebuild in quite the same way. And with that, we have truly come to the end of this story. Thank you for staying with me through all of it here on Ken's Story. Your dedication to hearing it from beginning to end means the world. If you want to continue hearing stories like this that take a deeper look into human nature, please make sure you're subscribed and have clicked the notification bell. I would love to read your final thoughts on David, Chloe, and the lessons from their journey in the comments below. Once again, thank you for listening. Until the next story.